Thank you very much, everyone, to be here today, everybody online that's connected, and also thank you, Martin, for making the trip to come and discuss with us your most recent research. So, thank you.
Alors, bonjour à tous. Comme Camille a mentionné, la présentation sera en anglais, mais je veux m'assurer de donner un beau bonjour à tous en français. Yeah, so what I'll be doing this morning, we've got 2 wonderful hours together to discuss different things. As you see in the title, we're going to be talking about this concept of a corresponsive sports science, and we'll be going over some philosophical and ontological considerations. So, based on the invitation that I received from Camiré, the people working here are working in different facets of sports science, and so that's why I wanted to offer a presentation that would be able to reach everyone in different ways. I want to thank Camiré for the intro, but just quickly introduce myself. But I'm at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and so the University of Ottawa is situated in our national capital, so we're right between, if you've ever been to Canada, but we've got 2 major cities. We've got Montreal and Toronto, and then the nation's capital is situated right in between. Things are becoming very green. Spring is in the air in Ottawa as well, and but it's very similar to here in terms of all the trees are budding, and so it's great after having a very long Canadian wintry, snowy winter. So glad to be here in the sun and enjoying this wonderful morning with all of you. So thanks very much to Denis for being able to host all this, Kemi for doing all the work for getting us set up, and I want to thank Ben as well. We're going to be doing an afternoon session as well with some more people, and to everyone else who took part in making this possible at the Université de Lausanne. This is my first time coming to campus, but it's beautiful, and yeah, hopefully we'll have a great day together. So this is the plan. This is what hopefully we're going to be able to accomplish this morning. I'm going to set the stage for what I want to do with all of you this morning. As you'll see, when we're setting the stage, it's going to set the stage for us to discuss, is there a way that we can peer review differently? And I'm going to show you an example of how that can happen. And once we peer review differently, then inherently that leads us to have to educate our students differently, educate our sports science students. And then you'll see as the logics progress, we're going to get to what I call ontological pluralism. And then I've got a question mark for the 5th one, because I'm not sure exactly how that can materialize in your current realities. But the question is, can we become together in difference? And the reason is sports science is very eclectic. It's very multidisciplinary. We're coming at sports science from different angles. But is there something that can connect us, even if we are operating a bit differently? So let's go. Let's set the stage. So the story I'm going to tell this morning starts with this paper. And you may have seen, or not this paper, but it's in the title of my presentation. So on a corresponsive sports science, you may recognize these names. So Carl Woods is a good colleague of mine, and Dr. Araujo and Keith Davids have done a lot of work in this space for decades now. So when this paper came out, definitely I read it, and then I read it again, and then I reached out to Carl. I was like, Carl, I think you've got something here. So Carl's a good colleague of mine. He's the first author. He's at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, and he's associate professor there. But when the paper came out, Carl was at Victoria University in Melbourne. And so I said, Carl, we got to find a way to keep corresponding, to keep the conversation going around these ideas that you have on sports science. And so that's what we did. You can probably recognize maybe a few faces, but I'm in one corner, Carl's in the other corner. But I took a flight, a very, very long flight from Ottawa all the way to Melbourne. And Carl and I spent a week together, just basically discussing, philosophizing, and we got a group of people together, a really interesting group of people in Australia together, and we spent the whole day talking about vibrant conversations on how can we create more of a corresponsive sports science. So these are some of the questions, and so this was our agenda for today. As you can see, this was about a year and a half ago. We got together in October 2024. And if you can see, these are some of the questions, and these are some of the same themes that I'll be discussing today. So what is the responsibility of sports science? What is our responsibility when we go out, we apply for grants, we collect data, and then what do we do with that? What is the responsibility that we have to our societies? And the other question, which we're going to go through this morning, how can we spur alternative becomings? So you'll see those two words, alternative becomings, are going to come back again. And as you see, our last scene is, how can we become together in difference in sports science through the ideals of ontological pluralism? So that carried us, and as you'll see, I'll continue the progression. But those are questions that we've been thinking over, we've been reflecting on for the last year and a half, and hopefully we can continue this conversation this morning and beyond. So I just want to do a quick warm-up. Again, we're all physical activity, sport people, so I'm not going to ask you to get out of your chairs, but the warm-up is going to be cognitive. So I want you to think, sports science, it's a term in English. In French, we can say les sciences du sport. But what exactly, like, what is sports science? Have we ever taken the time to think, but what are we actually doing? So what is sports science? What does it do? If we think about the contributions, we're at the University of Lausanne right now. What is its contribution? What does it do? And then ultimately, probably the toughest question is, what are the logics and assumptions that underpin the doings of sports science? So I don't want to take too long on this, but I know this is a question that very little of us have asked themselves before. So we can do the same thing online. Online people can reflect more on their own, but if you want to just, whoever is with you as a colleague, but let's take 2 or 3 minutes. If you can think about these questions, and then I probably want to hear from a few of you after that. Like, what is these questions? So I've got 10, 17 here. So let's take 2, 3, 4 minutes, and that'll be our cognitive warm-up, and then we'll continue on. So get together, just ask these questions, and I'm going to ask a few of you to tell me what you think after that. So, apologies for interrupting the conversation. I can see, or I can hear that there's a lot of really good conversations going on, which is great. So we've accomplished our goal. We're warmed up. We're really ready to discuss these themes now. But I really love, I'm curious. I'd love to hear, maybe let's start with the first question. But what is sports science? What is that? If anyone wants to quickly just say a quick words that they discussed. What is it? There was an interesting discussion here, but maybe others have something to say about that. What is it? Again, there's no right or wrong answers. You'll see that the right or wrong dichotomy is going to diffuse very soon. So, go ahead.
I think sports science is something that's a mixture of different sciences: biomechanics, psychology, social science, but how people interconnect. And we just explore the social and empirical side of sports in a specific setting. So that is what sports science do for not only the general public or the players that is playing. And it is just from the empirical side of the sports, that how the game is being conducted in a specific environment.
Okay. So just to summarize for our online audience, but there's different disciplines, and we come together. Sometimes we use the word interdisciplinary. Sometimes we'll use the word multidisciplinary. I've heard recently people talk, and that one's the most difficult, but transdisciplinary. I don't know if a lot of labs are able to achieve that. But to get together, and we've got this common idea we call sport, and we use the word logic, but the logics of science to get together to try to understand this thing we call sport. Has anyone had a chance to discuss, because I'd really just like to ask, but what are the logics and assumptions that underpin how we do this thing we call sports science? Anyone talked about that? Because this is where we're going to go, and we're going to look at what that does, and ultimately, can we do it differently to get to our destination, which is never a destination, of becoming together in difference. But what are these logics? There's a logic to everything. What are the logics that underpin how perhaps you do sports science here in Lausanne? So what we're going to do with that silence, because I'm not afraid of silence. I love silence because it tells me that people are thinking. But we're going to turn this into a rhetorical question. We're going to leave it open. And we're going to go in. I'm going to keep, and you'll see. So these three questions are important because a lot of what you probably think and you've been trained to think is going to look slightly different over the next hour and a half that we have together. So I'm going to do a bit of an overview of this paper. If you haven't had a chance to read Woods and colleagues' paper, it is a really interesting paper, and you'll see there's an evolution from that paper that I've been entangling with for the last year and a half. But we're going to take a look, what is a corresponsive? So why add that word, corresponsive, in front of sports science, and what does it do? Carl and colleagues, so with Duarte and Keith, talk about how we live in a socially extractive age. And we're going to come back to this idea of extractivism over the next hour or so. But what that does something, that creates a logic as to how we conduct our own research. And so there's different forces. And those forces, even if we say that sport is apolitical, it's its own thing, sport can be neutral, I have a hard time believing that. Sport and sports science is influenced constantly by the forces of capitalism, forces of scientism, or forces of representationalism. And there are many other isms. And we use those isms and they guide, and we can even say that they indoctrinate the way that we fly through existence under the logics of commodification. And this commodification of how we perform science is increasing at a very alarming rate. So this is a quote from the paper. I'm going to read it, but this is how Woods and colleagues see this idea of commodification that I just talked about. But the resultant is the following. It's a vertical ontologic that frames the sporting landscape as a static space filled with discrete objects, waiting for us to capture, to analyze, to represent, and then we sell it on as knowledge. Not only does this commodification degrade primary experience in the false hope of epistemological objectivity, it reinforces the unidirectionality of extractivism by setting inquirer apart, but also above from inquiry. There's a lot at play here, and we're going to continue deconstructing what this quote means. So what does corresponsive sports science do? Well, according to the paper, there's three major moves that we're going to detail and deconstruct right now. So the first one, the idea is of lines and becoming. So in a corresponsive sports science, and Woods and colleagues use the word inhabitants. And so inhabitants are not objects of analysis, but lines in becoming. So right now, the way we're situated, we are assuming that we are all discrete, independent entities. And so Brian is here, Denis is there, but in a corresponsive sports science, and I'm using the images to try to communicate, but we're all lines in the becoming. We're all entangled. These lines are crisscrossing through more lines, and that's the logic of how we should be seeing and perhaps conducting a corresponsive sports science. And so we are always answering to others. We form knots in a meshwork, and these knots constitute communal places in which inhabitants have joined. So we've joined here, and it may look like we're all independent. We're sitting in different chairs, but we are forming an intricate meshwork right now. And so that differentiating is never a separation, but also always coming into being through others. So the logics change. Instead of having discrete objects, we're moving to lines in becoming. So there's a very nice quote from Ingold that discusses this idea of lines in becoming. And so nothing can hold on unless it puts out a line, and unless that line can tangle with others. To describe the meshwork is to start from the premise that every living being is a line, or better, a bundle of lines. You see the image again, is to try to represent what that means. So you owe your existence, you owe the fact that you are able to be present here, not because you are self-fulfilling, self-regulating, self-determining, but because you are part of a very intricate meshwork. You are line in becoming amongst many, many other lines. The other principle is that knowledge is ecological. So knowledge is not just authoritatively cognitive, but it is always humbly ecological. And so it's not produced vertically, but through imposition, but grown longitudinally by responding through the lines in becoming that are always forming through space-time. So here, to try to exemplify what that means, we've got this quote from Menzies. Becoming knowledgeable doesn't just mean learning about the relationships between living things in an ecosystem from outside of them. It means coming alive to them from within that webwork of relationships, as you yourself become part of them, attending to them, and even attuned to their realities. It means developing a feel for the environment, for being immersed in it. So when we go out and research, when we go out and collect data, we're not something that is external, that is coming in and just collecting data extractively and then coming out. But we are forming the realities. Knowledge is ecological. We become part of what we are researching. And instead of having a distance, so inquirer and inquiry, we need to see that knowledge is always ecologically developing when the two are meshing, creating those knots, creating those lines in becoming. And research as a practice of participant observation. So this is the third main point that's done in the Woods and Owl paper. But we, so all of us sports scientists, are lines in becoming that form parts of the knots that we seek to know. So whatever it is that you think you've got a research project, you're going to apply for a grant, you're going to get your money, and then you're going to go out and research. You are a line in becoming of whatever it is that you're trying to research. Another quote from Ingold that exemplifies this very good. In studying amongst people whose background and experiences are very different from ours, the task is not to interrogate them with pre-planned questions, answering to our personal agenda, but rather to observe what they do and listen to what they have to say, and to learn, as far as practically possible, to perceive things in ways that correspond with theirs. So again, you see, these three principles are not independent. The lines in becoming allow knowledge to be ecological, for research to be about participant observation. The three mesh together. So what is ultimately a corresponsive sports science? Well, it can be a lot of things, but the logics and assumption that are a bit different from what we usually do is it's a call to responsibly open up to that which instigates our curiosity. So corresponsive sports science is curious. It's responding with care. It's responding with sensitivity. And it's responding with sincerity. So if we're going to take the responsibility to do careful research, to do sensitive research, then perhaps we need to do things a bit different. And I'm going to show you an example. And this is where we're going to get into our second point of today's presentation. I'm going to show you an example of peer reviewing differently that allows us to engage in a corresponsive sports science. So I'm going to go back to the Woods and Owl paper. As you can see, it was published in the journal Sports Medicine. So this was the paper that was published late 2023. It came out in an official number and a volume and number in 2024. But what was really cool about this experience is that one of the two editors, so Steve McMillan is one of the two editors for this journal, really open to doing things differently. And you would not believe that this would be the case being a sports medicine journal, but there is an openness to do things a bit differently. And I'm going to show you and tell you what that difference was. So when Carl originally submitted the paper to Sports Medicine, the two reviewers that were chosen for this paper were John Van de Kamp, which is in Amsterdam, and then Alex Lascu, who's in Australia. But then they received the paper, and then it was John who instigated a different process. He said, hey, this paper is different. I cannot review this paper under the logics of blind peer review. And then he submitted an email to the editor, Steve McMillan, saying, instead of writing a review for this paper, can I write a response to it? Like, okay, let's do that. But if you're going to do that, we need to ask Alex to also do a response. And so Alex was approached, and Alex is very open-minded, said, okay, I'll do a response as well. So they did not engage in a typical, conventional peer review, but they actually wrote a response to the paper, a response that was corresponsive. And you can see here, these responses were actually published. And so at the bottom, you can see on a Corresponsive Sports Science, which is the original paper, but then 4 responses were published after that. So the first one was from John, the second one was from Alex, and these were supposed to be the original 2 reviews. And then Carl actually engaged in a response to John's response, so keeping the conversation going. And then Carl approached me and he said, hey, Martin, do you want to participate in this conversation? And I said, yes, I absolutely do. And so Carl asked me, and so you'll see a lot of my background, a lot of the theories I use now to frame my work are coming from Karen Barad's and the ontology of agential realism. And one of the key concepts in that ontology is the concept of interaction. And so Carl and I remember it was quite late for me, and it was early morning for him in Brisbane. And then he told me, Martin, can you diffract the concept of correspondence through the concept of interaction? And I said, I don't know, but I'm going to try. And so that's what I did. And so this is the paper. So this was published about 6 to 7 months after the original paper came out. But this is the exercise I undertook, which was a response to the original paper, but framed as a diffraction. And so diffraction is not a separation, but it's an entanglement. And so Carl asked me, can you diffract correspondence through the concept of interaction? So I'm going to show you what it did, what it materialized as. And so in this paper, which is, it's a response, it's a pretty short paper, but it materializes in 3 ontological moves that I'm going to describe now. And so, like I said, a lot of my work is inspired by Karen Barad's agential realist ontology. If you want to learn more, her seminal book is Meeting the Universe Halfway. This is a 2007 book. It was published from University Press. An absolutely wonderful paper is also the 2003 paper, Posthumanist Performativity. And I would tell you, if you're going to want to look and get into Karen Barad's work, I'd say don't miss the 2014 paper on diffracting diffraction. But so those were my inspirations in writing this response. So the first thing I did is I wanted to dilate, but also entangle the inhabitant. So if you remember when I described the original correspondence paper, we talked about inhabitants. And this is the wording that Carl, Duarte, and Keith used. But I said, if we're going to diffract interaction to correspondence, we need to dilate who these inhabitants are. And the reason is that a lot of our sports science ends up being very anthropocentric. We study humans for our own knowing purposes. But we know that human movement, sport, is a lot more than human. There's a lot more going on than just human variables. And so in an interactive sports science, agency, and so the ability to make choices, the ability to choose, is not only human dominion. It's not only humans choosing to engage in knowledge practices about the world, but these agencies are distributed through humans, yes. So we'll study coaches, we'll study athletes. But we need to recognize in the purview of our analyses that what we're doing is much more than human. So I've got images. Knowledge or sport is political. You can see, I don't know if it made the news in Switzerland a few years back, but with Colin Kaepernick kneeling for police brutality in the United States. Sport is not just neutral, sport is political. Sport is also involving animals. Anyone that's ever done a question, try to do a question. It's not a human-only sport. Sport is technological. In 2 days or 3 days' time, the Grand Prix is going to be in Montreal. It's in Canada, and it's definitely a sport that has a lot of technology involved. And this is actually, so I've got weather. So this is actually the Canadian National Championship last year. It was played in November, and there was 35 centimeters of snow that fell during the game. They had to change the ball. The ball was white, but the players couldn't see the ball, so they took out a fluorescent yellow ball. And Ottawa was in the final. The game was being played in my hometown, and we won the game. But weather was definitely involved. So when you piece all that together, there are so many variables that extend beyond our agency that we need to consider if we're going to be doing corresponsive but also interactive sports science. So when engaging in sports science, we not only correspond epistemologically. It's not, when we do sports science, it's not just a practice of knowing, but we are always already entangling through one another and the entire world in differentiating, entangling performances of cutting together apart. And so this is intricate language that speaks a lot. Differentiating and entangling are one thing. Cutting together apart, again, this is language that comes to us from abroad. But what allows us to materialize as us is always a differentiating and entangling performance that happens all at once. And this differentiating, entangling is human, but also more than human. And I think that's something that we do not account for enough in sports science. We also need to look, and then I'm going to show examples, that the way that we do sports science is very much epistemologically oriented. And so Carl and Keith and Duarte in their paper talk about, they use a lot of terminology that is epistemological in nature. And they'll say, like, we're doing sports science alongside, we are joining with others, we are joining with, we are doing things in between. But all of these words, to name others, to talk about something that is in between, it assumes the pre-existence of a scientist that is choosing out of their own volition to join alongside other humans to engage in practices of knowing. So we have humans that choose to correspond in order to know. But if we get into some of these ideas about things being entangled, we see that quantum entanglement, there is no two separate entities that pre-exist. Everything just meshes and forms as it goes. And so knowing is never an isolated practice that is done or instigated by an independent agentic scientist. Knowing is always ethical, and knowing is always ontological. And those things are always enmeshed. And that's why it creates the very complex word, ethical onto epistemology. So knowledge is not something that we do independent of everything else. Knowledge is a practice of becoming, and it's always an ethical practice. So if you want to learn more about ethical onto epistemology, we're going to be diving into that a bit more this afternoon. And then finally, in a lot of work that we do, we separate primary experience from secondary information. And when everything is entangled, that separation simply does not make any sense. And so in interactive sports science, the scientist is not within a field of study, but of that field. And you may think that the words within and of mean the same thing, but ontologically speaking, they come from two very different places. When we are within something, it says that we have two pre-existing entities. Like, let's say I've got the image here, a garden, and you've got a gardener that comes in that will take care of the garden. But the two remain separate. But we have to see that the gardener is always of the garden. And as they mesh together, one creates the other. They differentiate and entangle at the same time. So from the logics of ethical onto epistemology, that primary experience versus secondary information, that ideal, that separation must be drawn. And so the gardener doesn't just come in learning to take care of that garden, but the person is and always continues to be of that garden. And so their knowing of the garden, and so you can make the equation to sports science, is always an onto-epistemological performance, worlding the world. And so the world here becomes a verb. Through our research, through all the things that you do in research, you're not only observing a static, separate world, but you are worlding that world as you research. The research apparatus, you, is always involved in the creating of the world that you are researching. Ongoing articulation. And so you can see that we're getting into difference that is different now. And we're going to continue to make things more and more different as we go this morning. But the main thing, again, this paper that I wrote was to try to see, can we have a sports science that goes beyond correspondence, but that a sports science that starts to interact. And to be able to do that, we need to stop seeing things as separate, but everything co-constituting one another. So this is a quote here, and perhaps it will help you understand what the concept of interaction does. Perhaps it's only going to confuse you more, but I think it's a beautiful quote that demonstrates that we are all entangled. You may see, you may think, you may have woken up this morning thinking that you are an independent entity making your own choices, but that, again, according to quantum physics, that just simply is not the case. So Barat tells us, and this is from a very recent paper from last year. So I'm going to try to read it out. Again, we don't have to have an uncomfortable silence, but I'm going to give you time to process what this quote means. But touching the other is touching all others, including the self. And touching the self entails touching the stranger with it. Is that poetic? Perhaps. Is that confusing? Perhaps. Is it all these things together? Probably. But it really exemplifies that we're all connected. And not just connected at a human level, but we're connected to everything that surrounds us. And if we don't account for that in sports science, I think we're missing a bit of the boat. And sports science is about movement. We talk about movement. Some of us in our departments even have the word movement, the Department of Movement and Sports Studies. Okay? But what is movement? Well, the first assumption that we have is that, well, you have a human that decides to move. Is that really how it works? Is that our starting point? Well, Manning would tell us that it is not. So I like surfing. I'm a terrible surfer, but I just love the beauty of what surfing exemplifies as movement. And you may see three things here. You may see a human, you may see a board, and you may see a wave. But there aren't three things here. What's going on is it's not the subject or the preformed body doing the movement. It's the relational field itself that is moving. Again, that changes the game. Like, what are we actually doing when we're studying movement? And our starting point is always the agentic, self-contained, bounded human. We don't move in isolation. We're not disconnected from everything else and then moving in a container that we call space. We are always interconnecting with everything else that surrounds us. And it doesn't even surround us. It filters through us all the time. So when we diffract, and this is the exercise I did, correspondence through interaction, to me, this is what happens. And I'm going to try to sum it up in one sentence. But it shifts the study of sports science from an act of attending to the cognitions, the emotions, and the emotions of separate others to an act of responding justly to entangled composites. So then you're probably asking, okay, well, Martin, like, how do I go back to my lab and what research questions am I going to have to conceive to research justly entangled composites? Like, how do I do that? Well, I don't have an answer for you. I'm not here to provide answers, but hopefully I'm able to instigate different questions. What do we need to do now? How do we do this? Or do we just ignore this and keep on going, doing what we're doing right now? So, if we are changing the game, if sports science becomes something that is drastically different, then I think we all have a duty, especially in people in positions like Denis and myself and others that are professors. We have a responsibility for the next generation of researchers to educate differently. We can't expect that a new sports science is going to come along if we're still educating students the same way. So in terms of logics, the next logical progression is to educate differently. And Carl and I discussed this. We discussed this at length. And we got together with Véronique Huchard and John Vandekamp, and we wrote a paper that just came out, probably, I'd say 4, 5, 6 months ago. I'm not exactly sure, but it's in Sport, Education, and Society. But we talk about education. So on the topic of education, we need corresponsive sports science. And so similar to the other papers, this paper here is structured in 3 educational sensibilities. And so if we are to educate differently, how can we go about doing that? So I'm going to go over these 3 educational sensibilities now. The first one we talk is responsibility. So when training the next generation of sports scientists, we should enable students the opportunity to encounter a different kind of different that operates differently. So I'm using a play on words here with difference, just to demonstrate that difference is not just doing this and going here, but we need an entirely new world of ideas, where again, to encounter a different kind of difference that operates differently. So through these encounters with difference, students can respond and also be responded to in a diversity of ways. And then what I encourage my students is to read errantly. And so read beyond the sports sciences, read beyond sports psychology, sports sociology. Go out there, read in all sorts of different areas and try to bring back these ideas to sports science. And that's going to allow you to respond in a different way. So you may be wondering, like, why is Martin making a grammar mistake? Why is he writing responsibility this way? Well, there's a purpose to that. And so responsibility is a derivative of the original concept of responsibility. And I'm going to discuss a bit more what that means. So Karen Barad tells us our responsibility comes from the concept of interaction. So each grain of sand, and so we're close to the water here. I don't know if there's sand at that beach. And so if there is sand, we need to understand that every single grain of sand, each bit of soil, is diffracted and tangled through all of space. Every single atom is connected to everything else that exists across the universe. And so that's the idea of entanglement, is we're entangled through everything across space, but also across time. And so due to the interconnectedness of our existence, we are inherently responsible and must respond ethically to the phenomena that are entangling. So responsibility, basically the reason why it's written as responsibility, it boils down to our ability to respond. How are we able to respond? And so because we're entangled to everything across the entire universe, our responsibility is not a choice. It's precognitive. It's pre-intentional. This responsibility materializes from our very entanglement through the world. So the original way that we position responsibility is we position this as a choice. You have a human that is confronted with a situation that makes a choice to be responsible or not. But in a world where everything is entangled, that responsibility is precognitive. You're already responsible for the doings of all of our existence. And so it's preconscious. It's a preconscious sensitivity, receptivity, and openness to our entangled other. But if we're all connected, this responsibility doesn't just go one way. Responsibility is also our response that is enabling the other to respond. And so it's an ethos of shared powers and agencies. And again, these powers and agencies are never only ours. They're not ours. We don't have dominion over that agency. But if it's shared, then we're able to be responsible. My response should be enabling the other to respond. And then through that shared agency, we can create and enact a world that is more just. And so shared powers and agencies give us and others the ability to respond. And this responsibility is not only human. Again, I may have been talking about self and other, and most of you were probably thinking in your head, you were seeing 2 humans. You were probably seeing 2 humans. But this responsibility is more than human. And so that responsibility is a shared practice of enabling all human, non-human, living, non-living entities on this planet, understanding that we ourselves materialize through our interactive relationships on an everyday basis with everything else that is around us. And so in our current ecological precarity that we're living on this planet, are we response able Are we enabling the other to respond? Are we enabling this orangutan to respond? Are we enabling this tree to respond? So some of you may think that these are questions that go way above and beyond what we do in sports science. But again, if everything is entangled, these questions are not separate to us. They need to be part of our purview of analysis. So responsibility is an art of noticing. And so for me in sports science, we need to do a better job of attending to the complexity. So let's make things more complex instead of doing positivist reductionism. And it becomes our ethical response to the worlds that we are constantly creating, not just observing, not just trying to understand and represent. But when you get into the mindset that we are always creating the worlds that we are researching, we have an ethical duty, a response to do things in a certain way. And so sports science, when it becomes an art of noticing, cultivates a more just way for us to move, to body, and to live. And you can see, I'm using verbs here. So to move, it's always about moving. The world is constantly changing. You may think that body is a noun, but body is always a verb. We are constantly bodying. We are constantly living as well. So when we do this, when we know this responsibly, again, our job is not only to represent a world that is external and static, that exists out there, that we can understand. We're inventing those worlds. And to me, that becomes very powerful as a sports science. That we can go out there and we can create a world that we want to be better, whatever better means. But we can invent those worlds. We don't need to just sit back and represent what the world is. We have power to enact different worlds, and not just one. We can enact multiple different worlds, giving them the ability to respond. So for me, if I can sum up the responsibility that we have, is we must see quality in sports science not as adherence to predetermined methodological standards, which a lot of us teach in our research methods classes, but as a responsibility to notice the other, which is already within the self, responding in manners that are enabling them and us at the same time to respond more justly. So when you go out in the field, whatever it is that you're researching, if it's athletes, coaches, I don't really know what you're researching, but are you enabling the other to respond? Are you creating, through your research, a world that allows the things that you're researching to respond? Or are you just going in and extracting, hey, I'm gonna conduct a few interviews, I'm gonna take a few probes here, and then I'm going to analyze that. I'm gonna get a lot of peer-reviewed papers, and I'm gonna go up in my career, I'm gonna get to associate professor, full professor. But then, are you enabling the other to respond? Or are you just researching to extract, to take? And what are you doing to enable the other to respond? I think these are questions we need to ask ourselves better. In our paper on educating for corresponsive sports science, we also talk about differentiation. So again, here, differentiation, you may think in your head, okay, we have one thing here and the other thing is different. But differentiation is always entangling through entanglement. Things become different through their connection. And so in sports science, we should not only expose students to difference, but encourage them to actively take part in that difference. To challenge the normative reductions that we see in our very hyper-siloed fields that we have in sports science, each with their own specific way of knowing and doing research. So here I'm going to invoke the work. I don't know if you've ever been exposed to the work of the great philosopher Edouard Glissant. Wrote immensely beautiful work throughout his career. What I particularly like about Glissant is his idea, the concept, and the right to opacity. So the word I used before is this idea of positivistic reductionism. And so through positivism, that logic and those assumptions, we take the complexity of the world, we try to reduce it, we call it operationalization. And then we try to have different variables that represent that complexity, where we categorize, we separate things, and we try to represent the world as best as we can, in the hopes of reducing to one specific knowledge project. This happens this way. A always leads to B. And it's that linear thinking that drives most of sports science. And so here, what Glissant tells us is that peoples, cultures, ways of knowing should not be fully reduced or deemed to be understood. There is beauty. There is an aesthetic in the right of opacity, for people to exist differently, without being measured against a universalizing or normalizing ideal state of things. And this is what colonialism has done for the last 500 years. You had peoples all over the world living differently, having their own knowledges, and then colonialism basically universalized all that. You want to get a Big Mac in Hong Kong? That's great. That Big Mac is going to stay or taste the same in Vienna. It's going to taste the same in Toronto. I'm being sarcastic here. But basically what we've done is we've invented structures in the name of science, in the name of technology, of progress. But these have silenced, they've erased, they've darkened ways of knowing. And Glissant comes at us and says, no, there is beauty and aesthetic in doing things differently and not having to reduce everything to something that is easily understandable. And so this is something that we do often. This positivistic reductionism is very inherent in sports science. And how can we help in a corresponsive sports science, in an interactive sports science, preserve the nuances of human movement across cultures, across languages, and across geographies? So what Glissant did, and this is one of his most famous work, the Poetry of Relations. The original work is in French, but this was translated to English. But he used poetry explicitly to maintain the right to opacity. His poems were very complex. They lacked that translucence and that easy meaning that we're all yearning for all the time. But those poems, not having just one singular universal meaning, enacted the right to opacity. So one size does not fit all. And so here, the ethics of opacity is an intellectual posture. It resists dominant norms at the same time that it resists the logics of reductions. It recognizes that there is complex opaqueness in our more than human existence. And it provides viable openings for responsibility. So this was our first, but when we are responsible and we enable the other to respond, we can enable that response to not be our choice, but it can be different to languages, to culture, to different geographies. Avoiding the normalizing forces of universality. Again, I'm just trying to simplify things. In an ethics of opacity, 2 + 2 can equal 5, and that's fine. That's fine, that's beautiful. It's complex. Why is it 5? It doesn't need to be reduced that it's always 4. The world of 2 + 2 = 4 can still exist, but it means that other worlds where 2 + 2 = 5 can also exist, and there's no incoherence between the two. And so to enact this project, we need a different logic. And so these are some of the questions that come up, but how can we nurture an ethics of opacity that embeds differentiation in our thinking in sports science? How can we challenge the oversimplifications of the humanist epistemological project that we're all chasing? So how can we be more humbly able to recognize that things are never as straightforward as they seem? There are ecologies of complexity that simply lie beyond the capacities of human cognition, things that we'll never be able to understand about this world. And as soon as we realize that, then the human epistemological project, again, let's build a compendium of knowledge. And if we build it enough, if we fill enough gaps in knowledge, and that's how we're told to start our research projects. Hey, go out there, review the literature, identify a gap, and that's going to be your contribution to knowledge. Well, when we do that, we're enacting a logic of positivist reductionism. And then when we fill all these gaps, we're going to have solved the puzzle of existence. We're going to know everything. We're going to be able to hold hands at the equator and sing Kumbaya because we've solved existence. Okay, but that's what we're chasing. We're trying to fill gaps all the time. And so instead, how can we nuance? How can we complexify? How can we diversify our conceptualizations of what movement is, but also what it can become? And here I'm not using the word sport, because sport is very, very much constrained. Movement allows for much more movement of thought. We keep pushing the boundaries of the imaginary. I like plays on words, but for how movement can be moved to move differently. in beautiful plural manners. So keep that in mind. We're going to come back to plural. Of three educational sensibilities is this idea of curiosity. I specifically chose this image because that face reminds me of when I was 4 and 5 years old. You're a kid, you're just curious, you're looking at the world through a lens where every question is possible. And then we get educated, we get indoctrinated, we get molded into these rational adults. And what we gain in knowledge, we lose in the ability to ask questions. And so how do we educate in sports science? To nurture our curiosity. That holds us accountable to our responsibility to ask sincere. And when these questions are sincere, sometimes kids don't have filters. They'll say things because they don't have that filter. And usually those questions are very difficult questions. But how do we hold ourselves accountable to asking those tough questions? Not just asking the questions that granting councils want you to ask. And then you're going to get the grant and do the easy, safe research. I'm not pointing any fingers here. I've done that as well. Your government comes out and says there's going to be an envelope of $100 million on mental health research. As a scientist that wants to stay alive, well, what are you going to do? You're going to apply for a grant. You're going to get a grant on mental health, and you're going to do that kind of research. And I'm glad I did it because Camiré and I had a great experience together when she was doing her PhD with me. But we need to recognize that that's part of what we do. We're playing the game. But how can we stay genuinely curious? That takes a different question. So as educators, as those that are educating the next generation, we must nudge students into genuine discovery. When we expect students in their first semester to already have their full methodological plan and all their research questions already ironed out, I don't think there's much discovery in those kind of projects. You already know in your first semester what you're going to find in your third, fourth year and what you're going to defend. Where's the discovery? And so that discovery forces students to get into uncomfortable situations, and their supervisors as well. Let's go out. Let's take our telescopes and go out. Let's pierce into the unknown and see what happens. But that's not safe. We can't do that anymore. We need safe research that's going to lead to specific papers that we're going to put on our CV. And that's how we do most of our research now. So the path of curiosity is uncertain. And that uncertainty requires that students learn how to get comfortable with uncomfortability. The uncomfortability of not knowing. And it is uncomfortable. But at the same time, it can be very liberating. If you are in a situation where you can open up yourself to genuine discovery, not knowing can be a very liberating feeling when it is fully embraced. And so for me as educators, we need to educate sports scientists to be more curious. And this goes into enabling them to interact with different forms of knowing, with different forms of becoming. I've got a list here. It's not an inclusive list. It's just ideas of ways that we could do sports science research that, to me, so far, these are ways of doing research that simply have not been done. Sometimes I've seen a couple examples, but these are not mainstream forms of science. How can we go beyond Western thought? Have any of us ever thought about doing sports science research through indigenous ontologies, through Afrocentric epistemology, Buddhist belief system? And the list goes on. Confucian philosophy, queer theorizing, feminist new materialism. The list goes on. But there is a world, there are many, many different worlds of opportunity for us to connect with ideas that are not safe and singular and universalizing. And we could do sports science and study movement in a different way. And our curiosity, again, you'll see, I'm going to keep going back to that, but our curiosity needs to be not only anthropocentric. In sports science, we also need to be curious about moving and bodying that is beyond a human. How can we give non-human bodies also the ability to move and respond? And I think that's part of our responsibility of sports science. Yes, for sure, we're interested in learning about how humans move, but our human movement is never in isolation. And we need to account for variables that will integrate non-human moving and bodying into the type of research questions that we ask. So one of my good colleagues, Elizabeth St. Pierre, has this very wonderful quote, good food for thought on curiosity. I'm going to read it out. So we have ample evidence that the existence we've created is not ethical, and the piling up of that evidence forces us to imagine a different existence. It is curiosity about what might be possible that enables us to imagine and create a different, more ethical existence. We made the existence we have. It's not natural. We can think and make another. That is a task of ethical, and I added in brackets, sports science experimentation. So again, I'm going to reiterate this, but when you go back to your labs and you do your research, you're not only observing and documenting a world that is out there that exists. You are actively creating that world in every instant that you think you're doing this research. And so the world that we live in right now, the way, the norms we have, the rules, the laws, we all created that. The existence that we have is not an existence that is natural. We created it. And so to me, that's very powerful because it means if we created it, it means we can create something else. And that gives us a lot of power as sports scientists. We have the power to create not just one reality, but we can create many different realities. And this is where I want to go next. This is going to take us to our fourth part of this talk this morning. And so I'm going to entitle this Ontological Pluralism. So it may seem, Martin, you've got these big words. Why do you need to use such big words? Well, it's very simple. Ontology means reality, and pluralism means many. So this is how I finish. So we can create, you can see, we can create many realities. Well, many realities translates into ontological pluralism. So why? Well, first of all, what is? Well, it's how can we think about this idea that we can live in a world that has multiple realities? So yes, we live on one planet. We've had probes that have gone out that has seen, yes, the planet is round, it's not flat. And so we exist in one space-time. But that doesn't mean that we live on one planet, that there is one reality. We can create multiple, infinite realities. So why? Well, I think if we think through the logics of ontological pluralism, it allows us to account for diverse and complex ways to know, to try to understand how humans and non-human bodies can move and flow through existence. And so the way that we do that now, we can call it sport, so that moving and flowing. Some of us call it sport. You probably have colleagues close by. They call it physical activity. Maybe they call it exercise. You may have some sociology people who call it embodiment, physical culture. Some call it just movement. But to me, all that intersects. It's all the same. How do we move and flow through existence? Sometimes when we do that movement, it's encountered within the bounds of what we call sport. Sometimes it's physical activity. And again, we create all these categories, but it's important to remember that it's all part of the same ideal of creating multiple realities. And so that's why ontological pluralism, to me, becomes important if we're following the sequence of what we're trying to do with this project. So ontological pluralism, if we go back to our sensibilities and our ontological moves that we've done so far, it acts as a crucial component of our responsibility to remain an ethically defensible form of inquiry. And so I don't think we can assume that sports science is going to be around forever. I use this word here, an ethically defensible form of inquiry. When you're doing your research, and this is what I do with my students, I say, you can think about all your research questions, all of your methodological steps, but the one thing I want you to do is, at the end of the day, are you able to put your head on your pillow, go to sleep, and know that your research is ethically defensible? Not methodologically defensible, I don't care about that, and I'm teaching a research methods class, but at the end of the day, when you're going to get in front of your committee and defend your thesis, are you able to demonstrate that your research is ethically defensible? And I think we have that question to ask. Is sports science ethically defensible? Are we extractively just collecting data for our own good? To get our promotions, to get our grants, to secure our jobs, put 3 meals on our plates every day? And I think there's real concerns in that, but we need to get above and beyond that. The reality is we can't just play the publish or perish game. You got to do more than that. So we got to think about how the research projects, the questions that we ask, are they ethically defensible? Otherwise, if we're not following and creating more just worlds for our society, then sports science does not have ethical defensibility. And I think that's a genuine concern. So, what I talked about before, when I talked about the positivist reductionism, what it's done is that it has silenced a lot of other ontoepistemologies. And so I feel when we're able to enact a sports science that is ontologically plural, we're enabling, we're paying our theoretical debt back to many erased and darkened ontoepistemologies, ways of knowing, ways of understanding movement that do not need to be reduced to moderate to vigorous physical activity. Pretty much everything we do now is just like in physical activity research, it's MVPA, MVPA, everything is MVPA. It's the most efficient way to humans to stay healthy so that they can contribute to their societies, they can hold jobs, and they're not a detriment to society. They're not taking tax money because they're always in the hospital. And so we're enacting this MVPA as a way to maintain our economic productivity in our capitalistic systems. We think we do it for the good of the person, but it's really just for the system to keep doing what it's doing. So can we enact forms of movement, ways that humans move, that do not only need to be reduced to economic productivity? And so this is where the ontological pluralism can come into play. And I think we can do that by engaging, and you'll see my play on words, the backwards and forward. And you see in bracket, the forward is actually in the backward. So how can we enact a project that differentiates but entangles at the same time? So let's pay our theoretical debt, our backwards, to the ontologies, the epistemologies that we've erased, but also find a way that we can give a world, we can give these onto-epistemologies a platform to respond. And so the work becomes reparation and envisioning at the same time. And I did that. So if you want to take a look, I've got this paper in the corner, but I did that. I enacted with one of my PhD students this reparative work. And we did it. We did a backward-forwards look at psychometrics. And so there may be some statisticians here in the room right now. And I was in Brazil 2 weeks ago giving a lecture on this. So in psychology around the world is very much Americanized. And a lot of these tests that we use, like regression, correlations, we teach them to our students, but we don't tell our students the true story. Like, who invented the correlation? Who invented the regression? Well, all of these tests originally, when they were developed for eugenist-based movements. These were men that enacted these tests in the language of differentiation. They wanted to show the superiority of one race over other race, to justify that certain races should not be allowed to reproduce. That was the eugenics. And so if you're talking about the Spearman correlation, go take a look. You can ask ChatGPT right now, where does it come from? They'll tell you, these were all tests that were developed in the name of eugenics. We don't teach our students that. In this paper, doing reparative work, looking back at where this all comes from, the racism, the colonialism, and how that was developed, and then look forward. How can we repair? How can we teach psychometrics in a different way that accounts for that troubled history? So the other thing I want to do is, what does ontological pluralism do? Is it allows us to recognize that positivism is not the one way. It's not the only way that we can inquire. There are limitless ontological possibilities as to how we can do this thing we call sports science. People may think that positivism is something that grows in trees. It doesn't. There's nothing natural about it. It's a social construct. It was invented a couple hundred years ago. It's not de facto natural human history and reality. So yeah, I'm not trying to hate on positivism. That's not why I'm here. Positivism has done a lot of great stuff over the last couple hundred years. It's an approach to inquiry that's led to many important scientific discoveries. We would not be here if the scientism of positivism did not exist. Our reality would look very different. What I'm trying to show here, I'm not hating on positivism. But what I'm trying to get us to understand is that the issue becomes when positivism continues to exercise its unyielding dominance over other forms of knowledge. The problem. Positivism can do its thing. All of you that are researching through positivism, keep doing it. But understand that there are also other ways that we can inquire. And so we need, as a corresponsive sports science, to continue to destabilize the naturalness of positivism. It's not natural, it's a social construct. And we must remain skeptical of these universalizing narratives. Again, to build that universal epistemological project. Keep filling those gaps that I talked about before. And so to me, again, universality is very problematic. And Reardon and colleagues tell us here, I think it's a short but very important quote. A single knowledge and a single justice excludes too many. There are different knowledges out there that need to be better recognized. They contribute in different ways. We don't always need to fall on de facto positivistic human reality. So positivism to me is just a lens. It's an important lens. It's a lens that will continue to dominate. But we need to recognize that it allows us to see certain things, but not others. It's one lens. And so to me, again, and I'm going to quote St. Pierre here, but we must humbly admit that what we find in the world is what our system of thought claims exists and enables us to recognize. So those of us that are operating within positivism, you are going to find what that system of thought allows you to find, and you will not find other things. But there are other things to create, to invent that are out there. And that's why ontological pluralism becomes important. We can create new forms of knowledge, new ways to engage in the practice of knowledge that don't need to fall back to positivism. And if we do that, I think sports science becomes more ethically defensible in our ever-changing societies. We've known this for such a long time. I'm not teaching you anything new. Plato told us that years and years and thousands of years ago. He talked about it as double ignorance, not knowing that you don't know. And this is what happens when we accept positivism as de facto human natural reality. Most people don't even know in sports science what the word ontology is. They don't even know what positivism is because they don't need to. It's just de facto, it's the natural reality. In a lot of quantitative papers, you don't have a section that's called paradigmatic positioning because it's already assumed that the paradigm is positivism. But what it does in scientific circles, where positivism is just assumed, it continues to be the uncontested natural reality. And the image again is we're walking around doing our sports science with a big box over our head. It leaves us unable to fathom the existence that there are potentially other alternative ontologies out there. So again, there's nothing wrong with positivism per se. It's when we assume it that it's its unyielding dominance that becomes the problem, and there's no other ways to do research. So to me, maintaining the dominance of positivism has immense ethical implications. And again, this is what I ask my students. At the end of the day, when you go to bed, can you say that your research is ethically defensible? And I think when we maintain the dominance of positivism, I think there's ethical questions that we need to ask. What does it actually allow us to see in sports science? And that's why I have C, capital S, capital E, capital E. Because it allows us to see certain things, but not others. So see, these are some of the questions that come to mind. And I don't have answers to these questions. But if we continue to maintain positivism as our main lens, how much thought might we never be able to think? How many worlds may be left in the dark? How many ways of knowing may never see the light of day? How many ways of moving and embodying may go unnoticed? So to me, these are important ethical questions. If we are researching sport, if we are researching human movement, if we are researching more than human movement, Are there forms of movement right now that we are not accounting in our science? I'm sure there are tons. But again, when we fall back within the very tightly delimited world of positivism, these are questions that we just can't simply have. And so there is a question of ethical defensibility if there are important questions out there that we're simply not able to ask because we're always operating in double ignorance. And it's not our fault that we can't even ask these questions because we don't even know that we don't know that these questions are possible. So this is the culmination of why we did our little warm-up break. I wanted to know, like, what do you think sports science is? What does it do, and what are its logics? Well, positivism's unyielding dominance. What has it done? Well, it's pigeonholed us in hyper-siloed fields. I wasn't able to name all of them, but you probably find yourself in this list somewhere. When we were having the discussion, Denis said very eloquently, there was a time at the University of Lausanne where there was an interdisciplinary team and people worked together, but then the forces that be at the university asked everyone to silo themselves back into their discipline. And so what is, again, and reason, and Brian made a really good comment. Martin, why did you write sports science in the singular? Sport is singular and science is singular. Maybe you can think about what happens when we write it in the plural. When we write it in the plural, then we allow to have all of these different disciplines. There are many sports sciences and they can operate. But when we write it in the singular, it's a tool, it's a linguistic tool to force us to try to think, how can we all work together as a unit that differentiates and entangles at the same time? We can have our specializations, but is there a way that we can work together to enact a corresponsive sports science that is ethically defensible? I'm sure it's the same here, it's the same back home for me, but we have most of these people doing this kind of work in my department. People rarely talk to each other. There are colleagues I haven't seen in years that are doing work in other areas. And so are we really a department of sports science? I don't know. But those are the forces. They force us to get into our hyper-solid fields. And what, again, I like plays on words, but these fields, what they are, they're microscopes. And then we're asked to try to understand the mountain of complexity of existence through microscope. And if we only look at the world through the lens of sports psychology, the microscope of sports psychology, how can we actually understand the mountain of complexity of existence? Same thing, again, I don't want to pigeonhole any one field, but if you're only looking at motor control can allow you to answer specific questions, but not others. You're looking through a microscope. But we know that the world is complex, the world is entangled. How do we account for this immense complexity that is constantly changing? I think we need to rethink, again, these hyper-siloed fields that we have. And it's not easy. I'm going to go back home to Ottawa. You're going to go back to your labs, and everyone is going to keep doing their own little thing, have their way of knowing sports sociology, physiology of exercise. But what are we actually doing? Again, remember, you're deploying a specialized microscope to try to understand the complexity of existence. So we must rethink our practices of observing from a critical distance. That's another thing we do. That's what positivism tells us to do. There's a world out there. If you want to understand how it works, you need to minimize as much as possible. And then we call those confounding variables. There's a whole name, a lot of names for that. But basically, as researchers, we're never behind the glass wall. Even if you're behind the glass wall, you're already influencing what's going on. You've chosen the research questions. You've designed the lab space. You've recruited the participants. You've recruited the PhD students that are working on these projects. And so your hand is in everything that's already been done. Whatever we call reduction of bias is only a way for positivism to try to reduce, to maintain that separation, but that separation is never there. So inquirers always flow through the imminent river of existence of their inquirers. And I think the analogy of a river is very interesting here on multiple ways, as we flow through it. So if you can see, if the river is the inquiry, we're swimming in that very river. But also a river always continuously becomes. You're never going to put steps, you're never going to put your 2 feet in the same river twice. Every second, that river is a different second. is a different river. The water always flows. So not only are we immersed materially, but that materialization is constantly becoming, constantly changing. And so when we try to isolate the world is this, whenever we publish our paper, let's say in 2026, and the data was collected, let's say in 2024, well, whatever world that we've developed themes around, or we've analyzed, we statistically found significance for something, well, the world is already different. And so this epistemological project that we're building that's going to allow us to understand all of human reality, we need to understand that human reality is a constant becoming. Every second, the universe rematerializes itself into something different. I don't want you to see me as being skeptical of sports science. I think there's immense potential in sports science to become a science that is ontologically plural. But to do so, we need sports science to become a complex, more than human science that is able to study all of the inner complex workings of human bodies, more than human bodies. How can we understand different types of physical cultures? And if we do that in a way that is reparative, we're looking back onto epistemologies that sports science has erased over the decades. I think sports science can do reparative as well as envisioning work and research that can allow it to be ethically defensible. So I really like the work of Leanne Simpson. She's a Anishinaabeg scholar that's written a lot of very interesting work and believes in the power of human knowledge that flows through movement. And so I'm going to read this quote from Simpson, and I think it really exemplifies what we ought to be thinking about when we're thinking about sports science. And again, to demonstrate this immense potential that we have in the research that we do. We cannot just think, write, or imagine our way to a decolonized future. Answers of how to rebuild and how to research are therefore derived from a web of conceptual relationships that is infused with movement. And Simpson actually writes the word kinetic, through lived experience and embodiment. Intellectual knowledge is not enough on its own. Neither is spiritual knowledge or emotional knowledge. All kinds of knowledge are important and necessary in a communal and emergent balance. So to me, this speaks to the potential that we have in sports science. We study movement. We study embodiment. We study physical culture. And so that knowledge that we can derive from human moving and bodying, more than human moving and bodying, is something that is indelibly has to be a feature of how we can live in a decolonialized existence. I think the stakes are high. Stakes are very high. We live in a very precarious world right now. And so how we train the next generation of sports scientists, what it does is it can open or close onto epistemic doors for what knowledges get illuminated and what knowledges continue to be darkened and what worlds get created or erased. You can see here, I didn't use the word which worlds get researched, which worlds get documented, which worlds get represented. But we are creating this world. Sports science is an endeavor of creating something. And so instead of darkening and erasing, can we all become together in difference? And this is going to be how I finish this talk this morning. And again, there's an interrogation mark. I'm just not sure how we can do that, but we need to be thinking about it. How can we become together in difference? And it's not just a play on words, having together and difference in the same title. That's actually how things function. Everything differentiates and entangles in one move as a cutting together. So we're living on a damaged planet, and our inquiries, I think, need to be more just. And we may think that sports science has nothing to do with our ecology, climate change, but again, if we live in an entangled world, it has everything to do with it. Really, we're all in this together. And when I say we, it's a big, gigantic we here that includes everything that we see around us. And so when we damage the planet, maybe it's ironic, but we have to understand we're damaging ourselves. Like the planet is not here and we're here. Like we are of that planet. So when we keep damaging it, we're damaging ourselves all the time. And so to do things a bit differently, I think we need to unthink the thinkable. We need to think the unthinkable. And to be able to do that, I think we need to ask different questions. Questions that are different, not just in degree, but in kind. And a neat paper for that is Methodologies of the Apocalypse, if you ever want to go see that. And then another paper is this one. Most people don't think about that, but how can we reduce our methodological footprint? So we may think about always ecological footprint, but we need to recognize that research is extractive. And again, if we want our research to be ethically defensible in sports science, we need to account for that. So incessant knowledge production, we just assume, like we're in universities, we're getting paid to create knowledge. But incessant knowledge production is not unproblematic. And it's not, as a standalone entity, it's not inherently virtuous. It follows the same logics and assumptions of our instrumentalist logics of capitalism. Incessant GDP growth. The knowledge economy is part of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of GDP growth. Every country wants their GDP to keep increasing. Why? Because that's the only logic of capitalism. Capitalism only makes sense if it keeps going until it eventually collapses and obliterates itself. But knowledge creation, being in universities, we follow the same logics. Let's create more and more. Let's not worry about what happens. We just need to create more knowledge, constantly more knowledge. But have you ever asked yourself the question, is incessant knowledge creation inherently virtuous on its own? Do we need all this knowledge? So research is extractive. It requires energy. It requires labor. It consumes intellectual and material resources. It produces numerous forms of waste. When was the last time you talked to your students about that? You know, we just assume, hey, we're PhDs, we know what we're doing, we're smart people, we've been passed by our societies, we get paid really well to create research projects, whatever. Have we ever thought about all the resources that we're using to create this knowledge? Does everyone actually get to access our papers that are behind these paywalls? And then when they are open access, it costs 4,000 euros, $5,000, 10,000 Swiss francs to get those accessible. And that requires resources. So very rarely do researchers consider the wider ecological, social, and ethical impacts and costs of their studies. Yet all research leaves a footprint. Do we need an endless flow of new data? And I say new here, I put it in brackets, because a lot of the data we collect and a lot of the results we have are simply recycling things in different words, the things that we've done for the last 100 years. So there's not much that's been very innovative in a lot of fields. And so could we allocate this energy and these resources elsewhere in manners enabling more just responses for us and from others? Again, is your research ethically defensible? Is it enabling you to respond in a way that helps create a better world? And is it enabling the other to respond, to be able to respond in this better world that we're creating? So for example, something that hits close to home to me, we've got this big bad neighbor, it's called the United States, just south of us. They spend billions and billions of dollars on health research. And if you look since 2000, the NIH in the United States has spent over $2.5 billion US dollars specifically on physical activity interventions intended to get people more active. Yet, if we look at physical activity levels in the United States in the last quarter century, we're still at the same level. About a quarter of Americans meet national physical activity guidelines. So despite the billions of dollars invested over the last 25 years, there really hasn't been no significant major increase in physical activity trends in the United States. There's been no large-scale behavioral shifts that have been made. People are still inactive, they're still overweight. So again, in terms of methodological footprint, think about all the researchers, all the energy, all the waste that was created in these $2.5 billion of physical activity interventions. Have all the energy and resources put into those studies been worth it? Again, worth is in brackets. I'm not here to judge, and that's why I'm asking the question. Has it been worth it? Some of you may be able to answer yes, it's been worth it. Others may say no. But that needs to be part of our thinking if we're going to think through the logics of methodological footprint. So how can and should sports science respond differently? I don't have answers. Those answers are going to be up to you, but I have a few questions for you. In our socially extractive age, is it still ethically defensible to produce knowledge at any cost, just to feed the knowledge economy beast? And I was playing the publishing game to ensure that we don't perish good enough. When you go to bed tonight and you're working on your papers, is working on those papers in and of itself enough? It is playing the publishing game enough to justify the things that you do when you wake up in the morning, you take the subway, and you come to school. Yes, we have to play the game, but is it the only thing that we should be thinking? Now, in our knowledge mobilization efforts, I don't know how it is in Switzerland, but back home, when we produce a grant application, there's a specific section, everyone has to write that, but it's our knowledge mobilization plan. And that takes a lot of resources. There's usually a lot of money invested in a grant for knowledge mobilization. And again, the reason, the rationale behind that is economic productivity. If taxpayers are paying for our grant, then we need to be able to give back knowledge to those that are paying the taxes by making our knowledge accessible, by mobilizing that knowledge. And so there's a whole ecosystem of different ways to do research to make our research more accessible. But in our knowledge mobilization efforts, should we consider the incessant production of these neatly packaged knowledge McNuggets? And so I've got actual knowledge, like McDonald's McNuggets here. And so this is not just a play on words. Like I said, there's an entire ecosystem of research on how to test instructional designs for knowledge nuggets. They're literally called knowledge nuggets. Some people will call them infographics. Some people will call them different things. But there's a lot that goes into the production of that knowledge mobilization. Have we thought about the methodological footprint of that? Instead of always aiming to produce more, so that incessant wheel, more results, more impact, more significance, is there a way that we can think and do with less? Maybe less data? Maybe we collect less data, but we do something else? Maybe less extraction, always taking from our participants? Is there a way that we can give back in different ways? To look at it differently? Oh, it's a lot of us using AI now in our research. AI needs a lot of energy to operate. And we store these large amounts, these large databases that we thought about. Our data collection practices, our data storing practices, the amount of energy that they require, the amount of cooling that they require. Have we thought about that from an ecological perspective? Other than just paying our $5 a month subscription to a cloud thing that's just in the cloud, it's out of mind. But it's not in the cloud. There is a data center somewhere that's extracting a lot of energy, a lot of resources to store data. And that's part of the equation of methodological footprint. And I don't want to be hypocritical. I am part of the situation. I'm part of the problem. I ask myself when I do these talks, is it defensible for me to travel halfway around the world to give this talk right now to you? Now, there's people online. Could I have done this online? Probably. Well, what's my CO2 footprint flying from Montreal to Geneva to be here? Some of you may be going to conferences this summer, different parts of the world. Is it worth it? If you're presenting for 10 minutes, if you're presenting a poster, that's all part of the knowledge economy. We travel all over the world. Have we thought about that footprint? Now, you're going to be hosting ECSS here very soon. You're going to have people from around Europe and around the world. What's going to be the ecological footprint of that conference? Is that something that's part of the planning? I don't know. So, what are the footprints of your inquiries? I'm not here to judge, but you need to look yourself in the mirror and justify. Are your footprints justifiable? Are you doing things that offer an ecologically and ethically defensible positioning that your footprints are justifiable? Only you can answer that. So to me, this is part of developing a corresponsive sports science. We must jolt ourselves and sports science out of the assumed virtuousness of our research practices before we literally burn out. We must more responsibly consider the footprint of our very extractive, data-centric assembly line research practices. Most of us uncritically just collect data, we're going to analyze it, we're going to write, we're going to publish, and we just cycle. What's the next data? What's the next research question? We're developing these lines of inquiry, these research programs. But what's the ultimate aim? What's the ultimate goal? So it's easy, and I hear this all the time, and I use the same excuses myself. Wow, I need to give a report to my dean every year. Like, what have I produced? And we need to submit our CV. And same thing for young scholars that are trying to get the next position. Well, I need lines on my CV. That's how I'm going to survive in this world. And I agree with that. Those are very important considerations. But at the end of the day, I think we can't 100% just scapegoat the academic publishing machine for our inertia. I think it's no longer a viable option to just say, hey, I'm part of the system. I'm just a cog in the system. I can't change it. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror. And is there a way we can do something different? So for me, it's not about antagonizing. We live in a very antagonistic, polarizing world right now. There's different forces, different people that are separating us, forcing us to separate, antagonize. I think we need to organize. Again, sports science as one very powerful together unit that differentiates and entangles all at once. And we need to take on the challenges of inquiring differently in sports science. So I go back to my paper, how can we spur alternative becomings? I'm going to finish, I'm almost done. We'll have some time to discuss at the end, but I just want to leave you with a few Baradian words of wisdom. Again, Karen Barad talks to us about two things. She talks to us about a lot of things, but responsibility being one of them. So I'll quote here, responsibility is not a calculation to be performed. It is a relation always already integral to the world's ongoing interactive becoming. So we talked about this a few minutes ago. Our responsibility, as well as our responsibility, is not something that we choose. The very fact that we exist makes us responsible for the worlds that we live in. Same goes for accountability. Accountability is about the obligations that are built into the very fabric of the relations. And these relations are at the core, the fundamental basis of how we come to materialize as who we are as humans. And so taking those two things, those two quotes, responsibility and accountability, I'll leave you with this question. Well, after I finish talking, after you leave this room, after the seminar stuff that we're doing today is all done, how will you relationally connect to your responsibility, to your accountability for constructing a sports science that becomes together in difference? Merci beaucoup.